Real quick, guys, want to give you a heads up that our sponsor, Babbel, which is an awesome language learning app, is giving you 25% off when you use the link under this video. I used Babbel for just a few weeks before I left for my recent trip to Italy. I knew very little Italian before that, and I was actually pretty surprised how easily I could hold a conversation in Italian. Because of what I learned using Babbel, the lessons were easy to fit into my schedule, just 15 minutes a day. The progress I've made is motivating me to stick with it. I think Babbel really is the best app to learn a language. Go check it out. You'll get 25% off using the link under this video. On Friday, I'm going to talk about Joe Biden's recent campaign strategy, if you can even call it that, of sort of laying low and not being super public. But today I want to update you about polling, since it's been about almost 2 weeks since I last did, and it's actually more bad news for Joe Biden. Joe Biden's polls keep dropping. We're going to put the trajectory up on the screen for our video audience. And the story has been that before announcing his candidacy, Joe Biden was polling around the mid 20s up to the high 20s. And then eventually Joe Biden announced and said, I'm actually running for president. And that spiked up to higher than 40% support for Joe Biden. But since then, it hasn't been so good, and there's been a regular trailing off of Joe Biden. Last time I talked about this, Joe Biden's polling had trailed down to about 35 or 36%, and the last week has seen more drops to an average of between 33 and 34% for Joe Biden. Now, a quick note here before we continue the analysis. If you never believed that Joe Biden was polling as high as he was a month ago because the polls are supposedly fake, which I don't believe, right? But if you believe that, then you should also not believe that Joe Biden's polling has been trailing off. It's sort of weird to see the same people that say the polling is totally fake now cite the polling as evidence that Joe Biden is losing support. It's one or the other. You can't have it both ways. It's like Trump saying the employment numbers are fake under Obama, but they're real under him, and an indicator that the economy is doing really well. Doesn't work, okay? So don't do that. But in any case, who has been gaining from Joe Biden's polling drops? Bernie Sanders has seen a slight uptick into the high teens. Elizabeth Warren has seen a very small uptick, but most recently it's actually been Pete Buttigieg who has been climbing in the polls, and very slightly Kamala Harris. A lot of people are still just going nowhere. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard continuing to poll about 0.5%, unable to get it to move. Jay Inslee, Tim Ryan, John Delaney, Bullock, Gillibrand, Williamson, they can't even get to 1%. But there have been two sort of major opposing views on the Biden drop and what's causing Biden's decline. One view is Biden staying out of the public eye is hurting him because people are forgetting about him and people aren't supporting him because they just aren't aware of his presence. The other view is that since Joe Biden publicly announced, more people are understanding his platform and they don't like it. And thus people who thought, oh, well, I kind of like the idea of Biden, it's sort of reminiscent of the Obama era, as they learn about Joe Biden's platform, they are moving away from Joe Biden. Either or both could be true, or neither, depending on who you're talking about, which part of the country you're talking about. But in the immediate, the question becomes the debates and Iowa being the first primary or caucus. The reality is that Iowa depends on relatively few voters, and Biden is still doing well in Iowa, although he is trailing off there in the same way that he has been nationally. Here's my advice to you if you don't like the way this primary is shaking up. In terms of the people that are getting more attention, in terms of the people that are leading the polls, to the extent that you believe the polls, and generally I think the polls are a pretty good picture of what's going on. Don't get mad at the polls and the fact that a candidate you don't like might be leading, okay? Campaign for and be an activist for whoever you think is the best candidate, period. And soon the debates will start, and we'll start to get a sense of whether the numbers move. We'll start to get a sense of how people who are going to be voting in the Democratic primary are actually reacting to these candidates in real time, particularly not just to their ideas, but to how they relate to other candidates that are on the stage. The reality is that historically, in general, in June of the year before an election, which is where we are now, this is like June of 2015 relative to the 2016 election. This is like June of 2011 relative to the 2012 election, June of 2019 in the context of the 2020 election. The polls are pretty good at telling us who is likely to win the nomination historically. We'll see if something is different this time around. But that is a reality that we have to contend with and we have to accept. At this point in time, generally speaking, the winner of the primary is going to be someone who is already polling relatively well. Doesn't have to be the number one person, but it's extraordinarily unlikely that it is going to be someone who's polling below 2 or 3% at this point in time. If you disagree, let me know. Give me an example.